Welcome to A New Life in France, and today we are going to be bringing you a two-parter. We are going to be looking at moving to rural France. The reason that we're doing this is we start to look at the people who move to France, majority coming from the UK and from the US. You also get others coming from other parts of Europe as well. But in terms of our channel, the two main areas that we're getting people from, people moving from the US and moving from the UK. Now, within both of those, you get a sort of fluctuation. You do get those that want to move into the cities, but that's quite a smaller proportion of people. And what you will find is there are more Americans moving to the cities in France than there are those from the UK. That's not saying they don't traverse those, but they do. And then also in terms of that, you get a much higher majority of those from the UK coming to rural France than you do those from the US. Now, of course, those from the US will also move to rural areas. But we're just trying to give you a feel about moving to rural France. What does it actually mean? When we look at rural France for those moving, particularly from the UK or even the US, you're really looking in the south and southwest of France, a little bit of the west as well, and of course some in the northwest up in Normandy and Brittany. But the majority of people are probably moving from sort of La Rochelle down and then moving all the way down to the whole Côte d'Azur and down through the south of France up to sort of Monaco in that area. So that's the areas that people are moving to, and a lot of those areas, particularly in that southwest of France, are going to be rural. So let's look at some of these things. Let's get an understanding. If you're moving from the UK, a much higher proportion of people moving from the UK will have most probably been living in a town or a suburban area or a town village in a rural setting, but probably not similar to living in rural France. And that's something you have to remember. The majority of those moving from the UK will have been living with lots of other people around them. And that's just a fact. That's a fact of life and what's going on. So when you start to look at France, you look at that rural little, you go, oh, I'm going to move to France. I'm going to have a bigger house. I'm going to have a bigger garden. I might have some additional land with it. It's going to be peaceful. It's going to be quiet. That is true. But in reality, what does it actually mean? So I'm actually going to be running through some of the great bits and some of the less great bits as well, to give you that balance and understanding, the things you must really think about without just jumping in. If you come from a rural background in the UK, you are going to have a feel for things that happen rurally. It is quieter, but equally, if you're in a rural setting, it is likely to be governed by agriculture. So there's going to be farming going on around you. So there's going to be farm machinery, there's farm noises, there's animals, there's all these things that happen, and you need to be aware of those. And that is exactly the same in France. But France is so much more rural. There's such a high percentage of France is countryside, and agriculture is one of the biggest things here in France. And when you start to break it down and look at it, you are likely, if you're looking to live in a rural setting, you might be in a small hamlet, a few houses, or you might just have a house on its own. But commonly, it's normally a cluster of houses. A lot of those houses will be empty. A lot of those houses won't be lived in for a long, long time. Your neighbours within there might be a smattering of English speaking, there might be French speaking, you might have a much older population there as well, and you need to remember all of these things. So when you look at that older population of French, they will have lived in that house and it's probably been handed down generation after generation, unlikely to speak any English. Not that that is a problem, but communication, your French has got to be relatively good to be able to try and have a conversation, or at least try and get into that conversation. But those people will be much older, so there's not much of a younger generation there. Also then, you need to be thinking about lovely little rural hamlet. As I said before, you will be surrounded by fields, and that is great, but with that comes the whole of the countryside. So you need to think about, there will be farming going on around you. There will also be the chasse. I'm going to talk about the chasse in its own episode, but the chasse is the local hunt. That is a big thing in France. Now, if you're pro or anti hunting, it doesn't matter. It happens here in France and you need to be aware of that. So the chasse are there, People will come through fields, people will be farming, people will be hunting, and you need to just remember those things happen. A lot of things in France is about tradition as well, and with agriculture comes everything. It is so important, and that's where all the great food from France comes, and the French are so into buying French food. Local produce and everything that comes from the farm. So local meat, local veg, everything that goes with that. So it's not a bad thing, but you do need to remember that you could feel isolated. You've got to try and settle into that kind of community area. Within the communities, you'll have a commune. So in terms of that, that's your sort of local village area, and it'll encompass a few other villages. And typically in France, in terms of inhabitants, that might be 500, it might be 1,000, it might be 2,000 in terms of your commune. So that's your surrounding area. The commune itself will probably have a village hall in one of the designated villages for your commune in that area. And then through the year, there will be certain things that happen. There might be the hunt meal that goes on, and that's normally open to the community, and then you would go and pay, etc. with that. There'll also be other functions through the year. There might be what's called a randonnée, and so a randonnée is walking. It's an organised walk, and it'll do the paths and everybody comes together. You also might have something as well around the 14th of July, so you'll have it around Bastille Day. There will be the fireworks. Now, for some communes, they'll do it actually on Bastille Day. Other communes will do it either side of that on a Saturday. So again, they're all community things, and it is really up to you to get into that community. The community as well might be an older community, really tight. So when you're coming in, you need to try. You really need to try and find some common ground, some French language you can talk about, a little bit of a laugh and a joke, just to get yourself in there, but at least show your face. And it is daunting at first. It really is daunting to be able to jump into that, but you just have to have a go. Otherwise, you will become very insular, and it might just be, well, that's what you want to do. You might just want to live in your house, and that's fine, and potter in your garden. But it is important to just integrate a little bit so you're there, because you never know when you'll need your neighbour. And in France, you've still got that community feel, and people will help you. But again, help yourself by immersing yourself in there, otherwise you will feel isolated. Also in the countryside in France, you will have bars and tobacs that people will meet at. There are not the kind of things that you would have in the UK. So in terms of pubs or gastropubs and restaurants, there's not a plethora of those in the countryside. Some of the towns will have them, but they will be very different to the UK. So please remember that as well, that if you're coming there, go, oh, I like a pub or I like a restaurant. It's just not as commonplace as it is in the UK. And again, for some people, that's great. You know, for me, doesn't really miss it. I wasn't a pub person. But for others, they kind of miss that community feel. Now, there are other English-run pubs and restaurants, but you will probably have to drive a distance to get to those. And when we talk about driving in the rural community, in terms of buses and that kind of link, there isn't really that much going on. There really isn't. So if you're thinking, oh, I'm going to live in the countryside and there'll be a bus service maybe a few times a week or something, you're just not going to find that. You know, that is the reality in the rural communities. They're not really there. Now, train services, there are train services, but you're most likely going to have to drive to the train station. So you do need to think that you are most likely, if you're in a rural setting, you're going to have to be able to drive. There isn't that kind of service that's there. What you will find is there are taxi services that will be able to take you there as well, and that's another different conversation. But when you're rural, you will be reliant on your car to be able to get to places. Most villages, and when we talk about villages, most villages with a reasonable population, maybe a few hundred people, is likely to still have a boulangerie. Still going to have the bakers that you can go to. Some of the towns now, there are less and less shops because the bigger towns and the bigger cities start to have the things that people want, and it has an impact on economy and the community. So there will be less shops that are there. But you will find things like a small rural town will have most of the things that you want. So you'll have the chemists and you'll have the boulangerie, you'll have a butcher's, you'll have a small shop, you'll potentially have a bar to back, you'll have most of the things that you need, and then you'll probably have to just drive a little bit more to go to a bigger town and or a city. And when we start to think about that, when you think about a city is a lot smaller in France in terms of a small city, or a large town is a lot smaller than those in the UK. And again, you also need to remember that. So when you think about rural, you are going to be isolated to a point. There are English-speaking things that happen rurally in France. There are English-speaking groups. There are also lots of charities as well, particularly those coming from the UK. There's lots of animal charities, and the animal charities there will be a coming together of English speakers. They might have a cafe there as well, so it's a good point to come in. Now, some of you looking will be, well, I'm moving from the UK because I don't want to find other English. And that probably is a fact for many, but you still need to have that kind of support one as well, particularly if your French isn't great and you're wanting to still talk to people and have some kind of community. Then these kind of charity places, they work really well to bring people together, and it is a place to find out more information, ask questions in your own language as well to other people, going, what would you recommend for this, or what would you recommend for that? So again, think of that. So when you're thinking rurally, there's just lots of differences. So let's really look at your house as well. So a rural house, if you're looking to do a renovation, that's a massive undertaking. And then within that, you can put your own stamp on that. But a traditional rural house in France, you probably won't have carpets downstairs. That's not saying you can't put carpets in, but the way a French house works, particularly a much older French house, you'll have big, thick walls. And the idea behind that is it will keep an ambient temperature through the year. So fairly cool in the winter and again cool in the summer. And when you have the hot summers, it's nice to be able to have that. Some people will put air conditioning in, some people will put heating in. You will probably be reliant on a wood burner and those things that go around that. Now also, when you're in a rural setting, you need to think about the little things. And when I talk about little things, I'm talking about little animals. You are likely to have a mouse or two. You genuinely are. It's a bit of a rite of passage in rural France that it's not, do you have mice? It's how many do you have? And I'm not saying you're going to be overrun with them, but you will have mice from time to time. You will also have as well other little animals. There's a little animal called a loir, which is bigger than a mouse, and they actually look quite cute and cuddly, but they will make their way into your house. You need to be aware of those. You will also find lizards as well, and occasionally you will see snakes. This is just part of rural France. This is not me putting you off. It's just you need to be aware of these things, and and then you can tackle them. You can put mouse traps down, you can have a cat, you can do all these different things, but you just need to be aware of those. And when you look at your house as well, you'll have this lovely big garden, and that's probably your dream, to have that lovely big garden. It needs maintaining. And I can tell you, grass and weeds in France grow massively, particularly in that sort of central west, moving towards the south area of France, which has real actual seasons. So you'll get 4 seasons, but you'll also get this lovely sunshine. You will get a sprinkling of big downpours as well, and that just helps everything grow. So you need to think about that in terms of the way that you do it. Outside life in the summer in France is wonderful. You can be outside, you can sit on your terrace, you can enjoy the sunshine. You can have your pool, be it underground pool or be it an above ground pool as well. So you can have those and you can enjoy everything that goes round with that as well. Also as well, when you're in the rural community, you need to think about when you can be mowing and when you can be using machinery, and there are set times for you to be able to do that. And of course, you can't have fires as well outside. You can't be having your fires. So you need to check all of these things with your local Marie to things that are happening, particularly at the weekend. Now, if you're in the UK at the weekend, you're probably like, oh, Sunday afternoon, I'm going to get out on the mower, I'm going to be doing this, I'm going to be doing that. You need to be certainly aware of the noise that goes with that. So always check with the Maries as well. I think rural living is amazing and it is great, and you can have your own veg patch and everything. But if you haven't lived rurally before you move to France, you just need to be prepared about how that works, how it does it, and everything that you're going to be doing with it. So when you look at a property, don't be swept away with, look at this beautiful property, it's got a pool, it's got all of this land, we're not going to see many people, it's going to be lovely. Of course it's going to be lovely if you embrace it, and you must embrace it. There are many people who've moved to France, be they a couple, be they a single person, and suddenly the reality has hit them. They've gone, oh, this wasn't what I thought it was. So my tip to be able to do that is probably come and rent somewhere to start with. When you look at your holiday search and you look at your home search, put the two together. Go and have a holiday in France. Maybe extend the holiday, maybe make it 4, 6 weeks, something like that, but live in the kind of place you're thinking of buying. So again, you could rent a gîte, and the gîte could be very rural, but take yourself away from enjoying the holiday to, what if this is like this every day? So I've got that. Where am I going? What am I doing? Where do I get my food from? Where are other people? How do I talk to people? What goes on in terms of that? So you need to think about that as well. So when you're doing your search, we really recommend you go and stay in an area for a reasonable period of time. A week, 10 days, 2 weeks isn't quite enough, in my opinion. You need to be staying for a much longer time to get a feel of an area. When you look in rural France, a lot of the rural places, there is a similarity. So if you're slightly north, you're slightly in the middle, you're slightly south, living rural is probably quite similar. So wherever you rent, just get a feel for, could I live this kind of lifestyle and work with that? And you do really need to think about that. So this really is just to make you understand living rurally in France will have its challenges. It really, really will. You won't have the luxuries that you would have in the UK. You won't have the luxuries of dialing up for this takeaway food. It's just not really commonplace in a rural setting. You're going to have to drive to get your foods and do all your shopping. You're going to be very reliant on your car, and you need to be aware of that. You will be quiet. A lot of the time you won't see people. And your neighbours are there, but the French themselves, they do keep themselves to themselves, but equally you can create relationships with them, but they won't be popping in all the time, and you won't be having all these great get-togethers all of the time. You genuinely won't. But again, if you see your neighbour, you're going to have a chat with them, of course you are. But again, it's just a very cultural difference. The French enjoy what they do, and they enjoy the things that they do, but they will always be going out and doing different things, so get involved in that community. But really just understand living rurally is very, very different. It's a very different thing. It doesn't matter if you're in the UK or you are in France. Just living rurally is different, and it's something that people are just not commonly used to. So you do need to be used to that. But France is very rural, and you're spread out, and there's lots of different things. There'll be lots of empty houses as well. But it is a beautiful life. It is a great life that you can go outside and you've got your own land. You've got a big garden. You maybe got a field or two as well. You'll have a swimming pool. You'll be able to eat outside a lot of the time. You'll be able to enjoy different seasons. You'll be able to enjoy having friends to come over. You'll enjoy having friends coming round. You'll be able to live probably in a house that is bigger than you lived in before, or it just feels different and feels special. So the French rural life is super exciting, and I'm going to be going into that in part 2 of this as well. But just think about how you will adapt to living rurally after looking at this beautiful house, the roses growing, the fields, and a pool, and all of that, and being swept away with that. Think about the reality before you make that jump. France is a beautiful country. It's a wonderful country to live in. It has so much going for it, but you need to be at one with where you're living and everything that goes with it. Really hope you've enjoyed it. This is part 1. We might even squeeze a part 3 into this as well, but really hope you've enjoyed this, just to give you a little pointer or two to think about, should I move to rural France?